bitter cold of rural Minnesota bit at my cheeks as I stood outside Grimly High's looming facade. Snowflakes swirled in the night air, their beauty mocking the dread churning in my stomach. New Year's Eve detention. Who gets detention on New Year's Eve? Apparently, I did, along with a handful of others. I shoved my hands into my jacket pockets and trudged up the worn steps. The old school looked like something out of a horror movie. Broken windows, rusted lockers visible through the cracks, and a faint scent of decay. The place had been abandoned for years, its doors shuttered after what happened last year. Yet here we were, forced to serve time for petty misdemeanors. Inside, the cold was worse, the air stale with a strange, sweet tang, peppermint maybe? I shivered, casting a glance at the others. Kevin, the class clown turned juvenile delinquent. Mia, who could cut anyone down with a word. Josh, all smirks and swagger. And Rachel, who, despite her polished appearance, always seemed on edge. None of us were friends. Mr. Dawes, our grizzled history teacher, glared at us from behind a makeshift desk in the middle of the cafeteria. "Phone's here," he barked, slamming a plastic bin onto the table. I hesitated, fingers curling around my lifeline, but a sharp look from him made me comply. Time dragged, each tick of the clock on the wall, loud enough to make me jump. Midnight was hours away. Why this place? Kevin finally asked, tossing a paper ball across the room. Mr. Dawes barely glanced up. Cheaper than heating the new building over break. "Yeah, and super respectful," Rachel muttered, staring at her nails. I didn't need to ask what she meant. Carla's death had left a stain on this place, a stain that wasn't just metaphorical. The journal, when we found it, changed everything. It started with a loud crack. The lights flickered, the sound reverberating down the empty halls. Mr. Dawes cursed, his flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. "Stay put," he ordered, disappearing into the darkness. But we didn't stay put. We couldn't. Something drew us. A faint whisper, barely audible but undeniable, pulled us to the library. Dust motes danced in the pale moonlight, filtering through the broken windows. On the table in the center lay a tattered leather journal. My hand shook as I picked it up, the edges of the pages brittle with age. "What you got there, nerd?" Josh sneered, but his voice lacked its usual bite. My throat went dry. I opened it to the first page. Carla's name was scrawled in shaky handwriting. The entries were raw, filled with the kind of pain that didn't fade. Page after page described her torment, pranks, insults, outright cruelty. I could feel her voice in the words, each one a scream for help that had gone unanswered. Then the clock struck midnight. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Kevin ran to the exit, rattling the handle, but it didn't budge. The peppermint scent grew stronger, sickeningly sweet. What the hell is going on? Mia hissed, her bravado cracking. The whispers returned, louder now, circling us. They weren't random, they were names. Our names. "Carla, is that you?" Rachel's voice trembled. The journal flipped open on its own, pages fluttering until they landed on an entry marked with a single word. Justice. It began with Kevin. We were in the science lab, though we hadn't moved. The room was pristine, as if plucked from a memory. Kevin stood frozen, his eyes wide as beakers and test tubes shattered around him. "Stop it," he shouted. "It wasn't my idea." But Carla didn't listen. A spectral figure appeared, faint, translucent, her eyes hollow. She pointed at Kevin, and suddenly he was screaming. It was as if he could feel the humiliation he had once dished out, the sting of 100 cruel words. When it ended, he collapsed, his body fading into the ether. One by one, they fell. Mia in the cafeteria, trapped in a loop of her sharp-tongued mockery, turned back on her. Josh in the gym, reliving the pranks he'd orchestrated, each one more vicious than the last. By the time it was just Rachel and me, I couldn't stop shaking. "Carla, I'm sorry." Rachel sobbed, clutching the journal. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know, please." The ghost hesitated. I saw the faintest flicker of emotion cross her face before she vanished. Rachel dropped the journal, her breath ragged. We thought it was over, but then Rachel screamed, her body contorted, her face twisting in agony. I backed away, my chest heaving as she disappeared before my eyes. And then I was alone. Why? I whispered into the silence. The journal lay at my feet, open to a blank page. Slowly, words began to appear, scrawled in Carla's unmistakable handwriting. For the silenced, I ran. The doors were open now, the cold night air flooding the halls. I didn't stop until I was home, locking the door behind me and collapsing onto the floor. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the town's clock tower striking 12. I glanced at my phone, January 1st, but the whispers still echoed in my ears. And when I looked out the window, I swore I saw Carla standing beneath the streetlight, her hollow eyes fixed on me. Grimly High remains empty, its doors sealed for good. But every New Year's Eve I hear it, the faint toll of the school bell, calling us back. I know one day I'll have to answer. The air in Charleston always had a certain weight to it, a damp, salt-kissed heaviness that clung to your skin and made your bones ache. It was a kind of town where history sat like an old coat on your shoulders, reminding you with every step that time had worn it thin, but never let it go. I had never understood that feeling quite as strongly as when I stepped to the door of the Starlight Opera House. It wasn't much more than a shell now, an abandoned relic, crumbling under the weight of neglect and forgotten memories. I'd been hired to inspect the property before it was sold off to make room for condos or whatever modern monstrosity they planned to build next. It was supposed to be a routine visit. I'd walk through, take some measurements, collect the antique props left behind, and leave. Simple, right? But as I walked into the lobby, my boots clicking against the dust-covered floors, I could feel something was wrong. The silence in the air wasn't normal. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, as though the place had been holding its breath for years, waiting for something. I wasn't superstitious, but there was a heaviness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I pulled out my flashlight and surveyed the lobby. The walls were lined with faded portraits of performers who had once graced the stage, their faces cracked and peeling, as if the very passage of time was trying to erase them. I noticed that a pair of footprints stood out in the dust, leading toward the grand double doors of the auditorium. They weren't the kind of prints I would expect from an intruder. They were too deliberate, too precise, almost like they were waiting for me. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping into my chest and follow the trail. The closer I got to the stage, the more I could feel the weight of eyes upon me, unseen yet unmistakable. The sound of whispers, a soft, insistent murmur, seemed to come from above, echoing down from the rafters. I stopped dead in my tracks, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but it was impossible to tell. The whispers were so faint, like the remnants of an old conversation. "Hello," I called out into the darkness. My voice bounced off the cold walls, swallowed by the vast, empty space of the auditorium. I half expected an answer, but none came. Against my better judgment, I climbed the stairs to the stage. As I stepped onto the old boards, the floor creaked under my weight, the sound loud in the dead silence of the theater. I took a moment to survey the stage, a relic in itself. The props, some still intact, others broken or decayed beyond recognition, littered the area. A dusty velvet curtain hung limply behind me, the fabric stained with the grime of decades. That's when I saw it, a small leather-bound book, lie on the floor near the wings of the stage. I bent down and picked it up, brushing the dust away from the cover. It was a diary, its pages yellowed and fragile, the ink fading but still legible. Curious, I opened it. The first page was scrawled with a name, Clarice Delacroix. I didn't recognize it, but as I flipped through the pages, a story unfolded, one of betrayal, loss, and artistic erasure. Clarice had been a rising star at the Starlight Opera House decades ago, a performer with unmatched talent. But somewhere along the line, she had been cast aside. The theater had fallen into disrepair, and she was left behind, abandoned by those who once praised her. The pages grew darker as the diary went on. Clarice's desperation bled through the ink, her words growing more frantic with each passing entry. She had been ignored, discarded like a broken prop. Her career had been taken from her, and with it, her identity, until she was nothing more than a shadow. The final entry was haunting. They will never forget me. I will make them remember, even if it's the last thing I do. I shuddered, the words feeling like an omen. I snapped the book shut, the sense of being watched intensifying as I stood there, staring into the empty theater. That night, the hauntings began. It started softly, like a distant wail, something sorrowful but faint, coming from deep within the bowels of theater. I thought maybe it was just the wind, but as the sound grew louder, more defined, I could hear it clearly, a mournful, anguished voice singing a haunting lullaby. It sent chills down my spine. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just my imagination running wild, but the sound didn't stop. It became louder, more desperate. I heard the whispers again, clearer now, right behind me. "You'll pay, you'll all pay." I turned quickly, but no one was there. My heart raced as I realized a voice was coming from somewhere in the rafters. I stumbled back, feeling the heat of fear flood through me. The next day, I returned, hoping to make sense of it all. The police had already been by, alerted by neighbors who had heard strange noises coming from the theater. They had found nothing. No intruder, just the old, decaying opera house and the imprints of shoes on the dusty stage, as though someone had been pacing there. But there was no one to be found. The eerie silence returned, but it was different this time. The space felt alive, suffocating with the weight of something unresolved. Clarice's spirit, her vengeance, was still lingering in the air, waiting for someone to recognize it, to acknowledge the injustice that had been done to her. I realized then what I needed to do. This wasn't just about an old theater. It was about a forgotten artist, a woman whose legacy had been erased by time and neglect. I couldn't let her go unrecognized, not when she had fought so hard for her art. I contacted local historians, theater experts, and curators. I gathered what remained of Clarice's props, her costumes, her music, anything that could be salvaged. I put together an exhibition, one dedicated to her, to the Starlight Opera House, and forgotten artists who had once brought it to life. The day the exhibition opened, I stood in the middle of the old theater, surrounded by portraits of Clarice, her costumes displayed under soft lighting, her voice echoing to the space in the form of her old recordings. The air felt different, lighter, almost, and as I stood there, watching the visitors marvel at the display, I knew it was over. The haunting had stopped, the whispers had faded, the voice had fallen silent, and the opera house, in some small way, had been restored. Not just as a building, but as a monument to a woman who had been forgotten by history. Clarice Delacroix had finally been given her due, and in that moment, I could almost hear her voice again, not in anger, but in peace.